What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Today, we're going to be going through my top 36 wide receivers as we head into week 6 of the fantasy football season. Some of the top wide receivers at the position on bye here this week. So we got lots of stuff to talk about, some injuries to try and navigate. Today's the big day for injury reports, so we'll be keeping an eye out for those. We are recording that before those come out. But let's not waste any more time. Let's hop right into today's video, and let's start talking about these top 36 wide receivers. All right, so as you can see, I got my tier maker pulled up on the screen. We got 7 tiers to get through all 36 players here in today's video, and the labels on the left side, those tiers are how I am viewing these players. If you're plugging them into your lineup, obviously the guys at the very top we're viewing as elite wide receiver 1s here in this week's slate, and the guys down at the bottom are going to be those low-end wide receiver 3s. So let's just kick it off in tier 1. I got 2 guys here. It's going to be Puka Nacua and Amon-Ra St. Brown. Really, only 2 small things to talk about with them. Nacua gets a really good matchup against the Baltimore Ravens. They are 31st in the NFL when it comes to giving up fantasy football points to the wide receiver position, giving up 36.7 fantasy points per game to the group. So this should be a smash spot for Puka Nacua. He has been dominating all year already. So yeah, the rich will probably get richer here this week as far as fantasy points go from Puka. Amon-Ra St. Brown gets a little bit of a tougher matchup. It's on the road at the Kansas City Chiefs. He plays against a defense here that is ranked 8th against the wide receiver position, only giving up 24 fantasy points per game to that group. It doesn't really matter for me with Amon-Ra St. Brown. He feels a little bit matchup proof at this point. The touchdowns have been there. The volume has been there. The big play potential has been there. This Lions offense looks good. And so I'm not too worried if you have Amon-Ra, despite the matchup maybe being a little bit tougher than most. Let's go on to tier 2. Tier 2 is these high-end wide receiver ones. I got number 3, Jaxon, Smith-Njigba, number 4, Odunze, and number 5, Drake London. Look, there's no matchups that we really need to talk about as far as good or bad. These are all middle-of-the-road matchups here this week. JSN's volume has been insane. Rome's touchdown upside has been insane, and Drake London is a player that I am still very high on, despite there being a little bit of an up and down start to the season for him. So all of these players, high-end wide receiver ones for me this week. I don't think we need to overthink them. The volume is there for most of them, and the big play potential is there for most of them as well. So let's go to the next tier. This is going to be tier number 3, those low-end wide receiver ones, and this is a pretty large tier for me because there's a big mix of players, with the top of the slate kind of being out, Justin Jefferson types of those guys being out of the slate this week. I think there's a good mix of guys here. So 7 players total to get through my wide receiver 12. It's going to start off with 6 of Davante Adams, 7 Emeka Egbuka, 8 Garrett Wilson, 9 George Pickens, 10 Jamar Chase, 11 Tetairoa McMillan, and 12 Deebo Samuel. That's the entire tier for me here. Lots of matchups to talk about. Davante Adams still gets that good matchup that I talked about with Puka Nacua, so same thing applies for him. Should be a good opportunity for him to get into the end zone. He has been the red zone target in that receiving game here for this offense. Egbuka's on a heater. We're not going to overthink that one. He's going to be a guy you still plug into the lineup. Garrett Wilson gets technically a tough matchup on the road. This is going to be in London against Pat Surtain and the Denver Broncos. However, this is a player who has a ton of volume. He's being fed the football. Even some of this has come in garbage time for him. I just think the volume's too good for us to really fade him too far down the board. I know the Surtain matchup's going to be a little bit tough, but Garrett Wilson's still a player I'm viewing as a low-end wide receiver 1 this week. Same thing can be said for George Pickens. It's a tough matchup for him. We know CeeDee Lamb is going to be out of this game, or at least we're thinking he's going to be out of this game. Carolina's been really good against the wide receiver position. They're currently ranked 2nd in the NFL when it comes to defending that position as a whole, only allowing 20.8 fantasy points per game. Big play potential, maybe a touchdown potential, but overall, still a player that's probably going to be a little bit more boom-bust this week than we want him to be. Jamar Chase, he gets Joe Flacco coming in to be the quarterback. I think it's a small, minor, tiny little bit of an upgrade to Jake Browning, but I don't think it's a massive upgrade. A lot of people are talking about this is like the best thing that could have happened to Jamar Chase. It is not to me. I'm still viewing him as a top 10 guy. Hopefully there's just a little bit more efficiency from this offense with Flacco. And then 2 more guys I want to talk about with good matchups. McMillan gets a really good matchup against the Dallas Cowboys. They are ranked dead last in the NFL when it comes to giving up points to the fantasy football wide receiver position, giving up 40.4 fantasy points per game. They're the only team in the league giving up 40 plus points to wide receivers. So McMillan should be in a really good spot this week to smash for fantasy football. And same with Deebo Samuel. I am not projecting Terry McLaurin to be in this matchup unless we get some more positive news throughout the week. Right now, he is not in my top 36 rankings, and so I'm operating with Deebo Samuel as the number 1 guy here again in Washington with Jayden Daniels in the lineup. Chicago has been giving up the 25th most fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position, 30.8 fantasy points per game allowed. So I do think he is in a great spot to play well well here this week. Let's go to tier 4. Tier 4 is going to be those high-end wide receiver 2s, and I got 6 guys here as well. It's going to be 13 Michael Pittman Jr., 14 Jaylen Waddle, 15 Xavier Worthy, 16 Stephon Diggs, 17 AJ Brown, and 18 Courtland Sutton. Let's talk a little bit about Jaylen Waddle because he had a pretty solid game last week. Obviously, his first time being the wide receiver 1 post that Tyreek Hill injury. It's a bad matchup this week against the Los Angeles Chargers. They are the 5th best against the wide receiver position, only allowing 22.1 fantasy points per game, but Jaylen Waddle is still a player that I'm very high on rest of season. I think he's going to be in a fantastic spot here in this Miami offense, and I still think he's a player we can view as a high-end wide receiver 2 this week with some upside if he can get into the end zone. Xavier Worthy at 15 is another player we should talk about. This is a really good matchup for him against Detroit. Detroit is giving up 31.3 fantasy points per game to the group. That's 26th in the NFL. Yes, he's been battling injury, a shoulder injury, an ankle injury that he kind of re-aggravated last week in that game. He came back and played. I'm going to view him as probable. He's probably playing this week. It doesn't really matter. I'd like to see him get healthy, but for now, he is really one of the main guys in this offense, and we still can play him probably for one more week as this high-end wide receiver 2 before Rashee Rice gets back into the lineup here in week 7. The other player I want to talk about is AJ Brown. AJ Brown is on the road at the New York Giants. This is a good matchup on Thursday Night Football. The Giants are 30th against the wide receiver position, giving up 35 fantasy points per game. Supposedly, there was a secret meeting between AJ Brown and Jalen Hurts and Saquon Barkley, and they have kind of figured out their differences, and supposedly things are going to be okay here in Philadelphia. I don't know what that means, but if I'm trying to read into the tea leaves, get AJ Brown the damn football. I think that's probably what is going to be happening here this week. I think they might try and lean on AJ, so we'll see what happens this week. But the squeaky wheel, sometimes, it gets attended to. So I think that could be the thing with AJ Brown this week. Still have him as my wide receiver 17 because I want to see it before I believe it. But there could be a situation here where they start feeding him this week. Let's go to tier 5. Tier 5 is going to be those low-end wide receiver 2s. I got a total of 7 players in this tier. Starting at 19, it's Marvin Harrison Jr., followed by Keenan Allen, Quentin Johnston, Chris Olave, DK Metcalf, Brian Thomas Jr., and Jacoby Myers is the last one in this tier for me. The 3 guys at the top of the tier are the ones I want to talk about the most as far as matchups go. Marvin gets a matchup on the road at the Indianapolis Colts. Right now, that is a very good matchup for fantasy. They are currently ranked 27th against the position, giving up 31.6 fantasy points per game. Drew Petzing has been a pain in my ass all year, basically been a pain in everybody's ass all year, but he said, I got to do a better job at getting Marvin Harrison the football. So let's see it. This is a good matchup. Hopefully that happens here this week. Keenan Allen and Quentin Johnston both have a matchup at the Miami Dolphins. And I know you hear that Miami Dolphins defense and you think, yeah, lots of fantasy points. That's not the case with the wide receiver position. It has been the case for the running back position. But for wide receivers, they're actually the 7th best in the NFL against the position, only allowing 23.8 fantasy points per game. Keenan Allen and Quentin Johnston are the 2 guys that I think are the most reliable in fantasy right now, which is crazy because I think the most talented player in the room is Ladd McConkey. But these players are players where every single week it's going to be a little bit annoying. I've said it on multiple weeks of rankings videos and things like that where we don't know who's going to be the guy to get in the end zone. We don't know who's going to be the guy that week. It's always just kind of a pass the football around and see what happens. But with Amarion Hampton out of the lineup, I do think they may lean into this receiving game just a little bit more. So we'll see what happens this week. Keenan Allen and QJ are both low-end wide receiver 2s. And that takes me to my high-end wide receiver 3s, where at 26 I have Ladd McConkey, 27 DJ Moore, 28 Zay Flowers, 29 I have Devonta Smith, and at 30 I have Khalil Shakir, and that is the whole tier for me. So same thing I just mentioned about Quentin Johnston and Keenan Allen, it applies to Ladd McConkey. I think he has less touchdown upside than those other 2 guys, so that's why he gets bumped down into 1 tier. I couldn't get myself to, put all 3 of the Chargers wide receivers as low-end wide receiver 2s. That just doesn't seem feasible. Somebody had to be the odd man out, and it was Ladd for me this week. When I look at the rest of this tier, like I said with AJ Brown, good matchup for Devonta Smith against the New York Giants. Hopefully they just kind of start looking at that receiver group as, let's get them the ball. These guys have been complaining. They've been a little bit vocal about, we want to be more involved. Let's just make them happy for a week or 2. And this is a good matchup to do it. So maybe that can happen for Davante as well. Khalil Shakir is another player I want to talk about here because it's a bad matchup on the road at the Atlanta Falcons. Right now, the Falcons are ranked the 6th best against wide receivers so far to start the year. 23.4 fantasy points per game is what they're giving up. Khalil Shakir and Dalton Kincaid have kind of been the engine of this offense. Boom bust, kind of sporadically having a little bit of Keon Coleman as well, but Shakir is more reliable. I think he's a fine high-end wide receiver 3 play, even despite the bad matchup here, but he's not going to give you much of a ceiling. anyways. Let's go to tier 7. These are the low end wide receiver 3s, and I got 6 players to get through the final 36 wide receivers here. We're going to kick it off with Calvin Ridley at 31, Romeo Doubs, Jameson Williams, Wan'Dale Robinson, T. Higgins, and last but not least, Chris Godwin. 2 players specifically to focus on. Calvin Ridley is one of them. Signs of life last week is definitely what we wanted to see. He's on the road against the Las Vegas Raiders. This is a good matchup. They're 29th in the NFL against the position, giving up 33.3 fantasy points per game. Let's see if Calvin Ridley can stack 2 back-to-back weeks of good matchups together where he can finally get some points and be usable in fantasy football, because I know some people were talking about, should I drop Calvin Ridley? And then right then he gave us some signs of life. So hopefully he can do it 2 times in a row. Jameson Williams is the other player here that I want to talk about. Obviously, he's the most talented player, I think, in this tier, maybe him or T. Higgins. This is more just a bad matchup for him. He is a boom-bust player on the road at the Kansas City Chiefs. Like I said, the 8th best against the wide receiver group. He's hard to trust. Perfect flex play, perfect wide receiver 3 play where, you have some more reliable producers in your 1 and 2 slot, and maybe JMO is the big play that can help you win the week, or, maybe lose the week if he doesn't get the big play. But overall, I think Jameson Williams is a talented player, just hard to rely on because of his boom, big play ability. And then let's just say T. Higgins and Chris Godwin, 2 players that I think are more talented than this tier. But at the end of the day, Higgins, not really getting the benefit of the doubt with this offense here in Cincinnati. He is definitely one of the guys that has seen the biggest fall off with the departure, or I guess the loss, of Joe Burrow. And then Chris Godwin still working his way back from injury. Going to be interesting to see how he looks once Mike Evans is back in the lineup, because I truly do believe that Emeka Egbuka has played his way into the lineup over Chris Godwin moving forward, and maybe become one of Baker Mayfield's favorite targets ever throughout his career. So we'll see how that works out. But for now, Chris Godwin sneaks into the top 36. All right, so there you have it. That is my top 36 wide receivers heading into week 6 of the fantasy football season. As always, if you guys found something today informative, entertaining, actionable, any of those things, you just want to support the channel, do me the favor, hit that like button. It is the best free way to show this channel some support. Also, make sure you are subscribed. As I said, there's going to be updates to injury reports and things like that throughout the week. We got Q&As, stash videos, waiver videos, all of that good stuff coming your way. So make sure you're subscribed. That way you don't miss any of that future content. And last but not least, make sure you go join our free Discord. We do have a free Discord linked in the description, helping you guys with your fantasy football teams 24/7, 365. But with all of that out of the way, I have nothing else for you guys today. So I'll see you on our next episode. Until then, peace out.